Have you ever read the book of Lamentations? It's one of those small, obscure little books in the Old Testament that most people have never read. A lot of people have heard of Isaiah and Jeremiah, and almost everybody's heard of Ezekiel and Daniel. But sandwiched right between those four great prophets is a small little book called Lamentations. It's a book of sorrows. That's why it's called Lamentations. And it's a fascinating book. Let me set the stage for you. Israel has lost their passion for God, and they began pursuing other gods, and so God made them into a weak nation. And he sent numerous prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, to call them out on their lack of passion for God. And these prophets warned them. They said, look, if you don't return back to God, you're going to be destroyed. God is going to send another country here to capture Jerusalem and destroy you. And that's exactly what happened. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon brought his army over, captured Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and carried everybody off into captivity into Babylon. And in the midst of all that death, carnage, and destruction, we have the writer of Lamentations crying. No, he's weeping over the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, if you take some time to read Lamentations, you'll realize, it's only 5 chapters long, you'll realize that God wrote a very interesting structure into the book of Lamentations. What I mean is this. Chapters 1 and 5 mirror each other. What I mean is this. You have chapter 1, an arrogant, prideful cry of anguish over the destruction of Jerusalem. In chapter 5, a humble plea to the Lord. Chapters 2 and chapter 4 mirror each other as well. In chapter 2, the Lord devastated Jerusalem in his anger. In chapter 4, the Lord judged Israel for their sins. Chapter 1, chapter 5, chapter 2, chapter 4, all that to highlight what he says in chapter 3. Chapter 3, he says, the Lord is faithful to those who love him. In chapter 1, in verse 1 of chapter 3, he says, I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. There's the arrogant cry over the destruction of Jerusalem, talking about God's wrath. But by chapter 13, he says, he pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. All of a sudden, he's becoming convicted. And by verse 19, he says, I remember my affliction and my wandering. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. In verse 24, he says, I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait on him. In the midst of all this destruction of Jerusalem, the writer of Lamentations is reminded of his own sin. And he remembers that God is faithful, and he dedicates himself to wait on him. I don't know what you're facing in life right now, and I don't know why some of you are asking, why do good things happen to bad people? One thing I can tell you is that there is sin in the world. Your sin, my sin, everybody's sin, and therefore bad things happen. But God sometimes uses bad things in our lives to get us to refocus on him, just like is happening to the writer of Lamentations here. But join with the writer of Lamentations and wait on the Lord. And join him in verse 40 where he says, let us examine our ways and test them, and let us return to the Lord.